everyone. Today we have our another new episode and we will discuss on the green energy. We have our world famous speaker, Professor Robin Durley, and he gonna discuss detail about green energy. Green energy right now is a very important emerging economy. They are heavily utilizing this green energy concept. They are developing many green energies projects and which may help to overcome from the challenging situation. And Professor Rob, he is a very good strategy maker for the corporations. I think from his strategy, emerging economy can take actions and they can develop the strategy in an effective way. Professor Rob, what you want to share for today's session?
Well, so talking about green energy and there are several aspects of it, but generally green energy has at its heart electricity. That's the nature of the energy that's being generated. And the different sources to create electricity, of course, vary in their greenness, if you will. The traditional way of generating, the initial way of generating generating electricity was steam and hydropower, moving the generation that was done for the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, which was taking mostly hydropower and using it to, and then later steam and using it for manufacturing. Then we replaced those big mechanical plants with generators, and then we can move the energy to wherever we want it. You don't have to put the plant next to the water source or have a big steam engine in your factory anymore to run the factory. Then energy generation moved to largely petrochemical sources, natural gas, oil, and to a certain extent coal for generation, which wasn't clean at all, and showcases that that goes back to the fact that generation really makes the difference now between whether or not, as does storage. And there lies one of the big difficulties with regard to electricity. We're reasonably good with regard to generating electricity. We get some reasonably high efficiency rates, but storage has been problematic. And with right now lithium ion being the most favored version of energy storage, both for small and large devices. But lithium ion has issues. It is nasty to mine. It is nasty to get rid of, and it has a fairly high thermal risk associated with it, where you can get cascading heat failures in the cells. And so the long-term goal is to go to something. I mean, interim goals are to come up with better formulations for lithium ion or alternative formulations like adding salt. Or going to something completely different. Long term, it's going to solid state storage, taking something like a super and ultra capacitor and using that instead. And they are both cleaner to create, and they don't wear out. So you don't typically have as much of a disposal problem. Granted, if whatever they're attached to wears out, you'll probably throw out the storage medium with the device, but that of course would be a problem for the environment. But in terms of being better than lithium ion, it arguably is quite a bit better. And one of the better parts of it is fast charging. You're limited by the speed in which the chemicals in the battery in a lithium ion battery can accept electricity. And a fast charge with a solid state, you're basically limited by the size of the wires and the electrical capacity of the system. You don't have a chemical limiter on top of it, and so in theory, with a solid state battery, an ultra capacitor, you could almost, assuming you can get enough power into it, you could flash it and instantly charge it. But the way we're probably going to do it is charging it over minutes, as opposed to charging it over hours. But so far with ultra capacitors and solid state memory, we've had a leakage problem, and that means it's used often to supplement. For instance, truckers use ultracapacitors to help start their vehicles in cold weather because batteries degrade, but they have not yet replaced the batteries with the ultracapacitors because of leakage. Their issue is, of course, if you're leaking electricity, then it's not a great storage medium, and solving the leakage problem is proven to be problematic. But the industry does think that they can get there. It just seems kind of doubtful whether we're going to get there at scale before 2030. Another way to do it is get rid of storage altogether and just simply do distributed power. We have several forms of wireless power that are being discussed. Most of the high capacity wireless power, however, is inductive, which requires the item that you're taking the power to be within inches of the power source. But that does mean you could do things like put power sources in roads and have cars drive on top of them, much like slot cars, but without the little brushes and metal in the road that would wear out over time. Though there were trials, I believe, in the early '60s that actually did treat cars a bit like slot cars, and where the power was pulled up physically from the road. But right now, inductive seems to be the way to go for that. That issue, of course, would be you'd have to tear up the roads, mostly interstate highways, tear up the roads and some of the roads, which would be expensive, and then assuring those coils aren't damaged due to traffic, vibration, and earthquakes could be problematic. So there are ongoing trials to look at this. I have my doubts whether they'll go anyplace, simply because of the maintenance issue with regard to the cost of putting it in, and then the maintenance issue once it's in is problematic. Another way to deal with it is go back to batteries in the cars, but then have inductive charging in parking spaces and parking garages. That looks a bit more viable, but again, the cost of retrofitting a garage would be extreme, and certainly dropping the power into parking spaces on the roadside wouldn't be trivial either. And cities have proven unwilling to invest in that infrastructure outside of trials. So in the end, while inductive charging may eventually be used in garages for electric cars, and both public and private, it seems unlikely it's going to move much beyond that, simply because the cost elements and maintenance elements of it on a large scale have proven to be problematic, and right now governments aren't doing a great job with supporting infrastructure to begin with. Adding more infrastructure to keep up probably is just going to exacerbate the overall problems. So the hope is we end up going to solid state batteries, and then we flash charge with a contact method. That we've got limitations in terms of how much power. Oh, I didn't mention large scale wireless power. We do have several companies doing large scale broadcast power, but the amount of power they can deliver is appropriate for sensors. Is still not up to a level where you could even charge your smartphone, and that you could sustain it, but you couldn't charge it. And that means that getting to a vehicle or a factory level of current is off the table for right now, even though Tesla clearly was going down that path before he died. So that's the power and storage. Then on terms of actually generating the power, your greenest methods are geothermal, nuclear, tide-based generation, solar, and wind, and each one has its advantages and disadvantages. Going to the tide-based generation, where you do a tidal surge and you use that to generate power, that's actually really efficient. The difficulty is, however, you're putting equipment into salt water and metals aren't a good combination, and so you've got extreme corrosion issues that you have to deal with regard to the plant, not to mention maintenance. If you've got to go down and maintain the plant, you want to put this where you've got very strong tidal surges, which makes it somewhat problematic to put in divers and have them work on the equipment, because the water rapidly around the divers, and so that means you almost have to bring the equipment up and services on the surface, and that does create a fairly significant service problem. It does tend to move, depending on where you put it. Does tend to generate 24/7, which is better than either solar or wind. Wind is typically generates from about mid morning to late afternoon, and solar late morning to mid afternoon, and wind is typically early afternoon to mid evening, when the wind is strongest, and so neither one of those are 24/7. There have been solar plants that will generate off of lunar solar energy, but the amount of energy they generate is degraded significantly. Probably the best path for solar long term to get 24/7 is orbital solar, and there have been several attempts to make orbital solar viable. The issue there isn't the capturing the solar energy, which of course is relatively easy once you get off the planet's surface. You don't have the atmosphere or the clouds to deal with, but the problem is how do you get the energy from the satellite down to the planet without a lot of loss or without a lot of danger. And both of those exist with regard to solar. We haven't come up with a way to create a physical tether, and that means you're using some type of a wireless broadcast method, laser, microwave, or one of those methods to get the energy down to the surface. And whatever that is probably going to be deadly if somebody comes into contact with it. Now you would do geostationary, but what if an aircraft were to breach the stream, the energy stream? It would probably be catastrophic for the aircraft. Not to mention it wouldn't be great for any flying creatures that happen to hit that stream either. You get a substantial amount of atmospheric loss if you're now broadcasting through the atmosphere. So it hasn't proven to be viable. That looks like solar generation will be most useful for when we actually have orbital manufacturing, and we go farther with regard to orbital tourism and orbital plants. Then you've got generation, as we do now for the space station and for satellites. That's generally how those things are powered. Geothermal's always been interesting, but it's extremely expensive to install. You've got to drill down to magma typically to make that work. It means it's really best installed in areas where the amount of drilling you have to do is great. And then of course that well that you've drilled, that connection you've drilled down into magma could be disrupted by earthquakes. So you've also got to do it in an area where the planet is relatively stable. And again, it's proven interesting, but just hasn't scaled up the way I think a lot of us had hoped. And that takes us over to nuclear. Nuclear is the next in line. With fusion being the most potentially beneficial long term in terms of a reduction of waste and an increase in yield. We don't have any operating fusion plans yet, but we've gone to the point where we've proven it's viable and that we can do it. Fission nuclear power, which is what's common right now, it does have a nuclear waste issue, but the nuclear waste issue is far lower than the waste issue that exists with petrochemical sources, either natural gas, oil, or coal. So it's greener, but because of its waste issue, it's not fully green. Now there are other ways to solve some of the same problems. Bioluminescence for lighting, for instance, is incredibly green. You're basically providing energy to the light source itself, which then retains that energy and then uses it over time. Certainly been popular in science fiction. Not so great outside of science fiction. I'm not aware of any large-scale applications of bioluminescence, practical applications of bioluminescence. So that stays over the horizon, and it's basically just for light, at least so far not viable with regard to moving equipment, and certainly not for moving vehicles. So biological methods, while they may be promising in the future, at least near term, don't seem to be catching much air, nor are we proving much progress. So that's the kind of the gamut of green energy, mostly electrical, a variety of generation sources with nuclear and geothermal being perhaps the most flexible for where we are today, with fusion having just promised for tomorrow. And then of course we've got the sub-concept of microgrids. You've got the concept of microgrids where you actually put the generating source near where people are using it, and that's often done with solar. Sometimes with wind, but often done with solar. We've got a question about what if you put the waste under the ocean? Yeah, we've certainly done that. We've done ocean burials for a while. The issue is, of course, again, as salt water is very corrosive, and eventually it causes a breach of containment. And introducing a lot of nuclear material, radioactive material, in areas where you're pulling out food is ill-advised. We certainly saw that after the floods in Japan, where a lot of radioactive material was dumped into the ocean. They're still recording radioactive residue in fisheries near Japan, and of course Japan heavily relies on fish as a food source, and a lot of that food source has been contaminated now. So the problem with putting anything in the ocean that is a contaminant is the failure of containment, and if that containment fails, then that material is introduced into the ocean and could contaminate the ocean as a food source. Not to mention it could do things like wipe out algae, wipe out seaweed, and wipe out the food sources that the fish themselves use, damaging the what is a massive ecosystem. And one of the areas that's doing the most in terms of carbon capture. So you definitely don't want to start killing off large masses of biologicals in the ocean, and putting radioactive material in the ocean might result in that. So good question, but we probably should not be using the ocean as a big wastebasket, because we extract food from it. So that's kind of it for a quick overview.
Professor Rob, when we're discussing about strategy, policy development for green energy, what type of initiative we should take when we develop policy for the green energy?
Well, because it takes a while to implement green energy, the policy should reflect what the policymaker believes the world's going to look like in 2035 if they're doing it now. Give themselves 15 years of advancement, and then target the implementation for that future period. Otherwise, there's a high probability that what you're going to end up deploying will be obsolete when you deploy it. And so you need to keep in mind at least a 15-year horizon when you're starting to look at green energy, because it's going to take you at least that long to implement and to design and implement. And so you're constantly looking into the future. So if you're starting from scratch with little or no energy ecosystem, then you're like right now you're probably looking hard at fusion and hard at geothermal as your energy generation sources, because those appear to be just over the horizon at the moment, and implying that when you get to the time when you're ready to deploy, that the technology and your deployment capability will come together at that particular point, and it won't be obsolete when you install. If, for instance, right now, if it would be really the wrong time to ramp heavily up, say, wind plants, if you don't already have a wind ecosystem in place, and right now would not be a great time to be putting in lots of lithium-ion batteries, because that technology is about to become obsolete. If you're going to do a lithium battery plant, you probably should have started that 10 years ago and be implementing now. But if you start today, by the time you actually implement, chances are that that technology will be obsolete. Space mirror power towers, come on, Bill Gates. Yeah, well, we've had power towers, solar power towers for a while. There are a number of solar power towers located in the U.S. and in parts of Asia. The issue with the solar towers, which were the amount of space they took up. The setting up a massive solar farm where you've got the mirrors that collect the power, and then you have a tower-mounted steam generator that uses that steam energy to power the generator, and the steam is created by the solar energy off the mirrors, so it's heat based. Again, that was something that was pretty popular about a decade and a half ago. I think that was before our solar panel yields came way up. And so now, if a solar farm goes in, it typically goes in with sun tracking solar panels, no longer the sun tracking mirrors and the solar tower. Those just didn't prove out to be as economically feasible against these newer, higher solar panels as they were initially. So at least I'm not aware of any new solar towers that are going up, though there are a number of in operation. And as far as I know, they're still viable. That you do have to have a certain amount of maintenance. And where they've made some advances is they're now using robots to do the maintenance on both the mirrors and on large solar panel farms, which is kind of interesting. They've automated the cleaning, because when you get dirt on either the mirrors or the panels, it can lower your yield rather substantially. Which reminds me, I need to have the panels on top of my roof cleaned at some point. But that's part of what's going on. So is he using mirrors to heat up the? Yeah, I'm not too sure we want to use the mirrors to heat up the ocean. The oceans already get way the heck too hot. You know, the ocean is one of our big heat sinks for the planet, and so one of the reasons why global warming isn't occurring more quickly is the ocean is a massive heat sink, and it's absorbing a lot of that excess energy. If we were to aggressively heat the ocean, obviously we would experience climate change quite a bit more quickly than we are, and that would be making a problem worse, not better. But as I say, right now, the mirror approach, the mirror tower approach, seems to have fallen out of favor. I'm not aware of any new plants that are going up anytime soon, or even in planning.
Professor Rob, like
Yeah.
when we go for more innovation on electric vehicles, electric car, how we can use green energy for electric vehicles?
Well, I kind of mentioned that. I mean, we're doing it now. The difficult, I think, the mistake the world made in going to electric vehicles the way they did is they should have done infrastructure first and then cars, and instead they did the cars first, and now we're suffering because we have a lack of infrastructure. The grids don't have enough power. I think when I was a battery analyst back in the early 2000s, we did a study and indicated that if more than 3 houses in a given neighborhood put in electric cars, it would cause the generators in those neighborhoods to grenade. And I do know that even when I got my electric car in my own house and tried to put in a level 3 charger, it was going to require that I pay for the replacement of the neighborhood transformer, which I think was about 40 grand at the time. So by the time I was done, it was going to cost me more to put in a level 3 charger than it did to buy the car, by quite a bit. So just impractical, and that's why we don't have any level 3 chargers in homes, just level 2. So we didn't upgrade the grid to handle the power before we did the cars, and now we're kind of dealing with it. We really, as yet, even now 15 years into the electric car revolution, we do not have adequate charging, and the charging infrastructure is nowhere near where the gas station infrastructure is, and it's unlikely to cross over anytime soon, and that forms one of the biggest underlying issues. Also, we never came together back at the beginning in terms of plug-in standards. Asia has their own standard, Europe has a standard which the US has largely adopted, and Tesla has their own standard, and now the EU and the US is getting around to the idea of forcing a set of standards, but that really should have been done before we rolled out the cars. And so we're constantly chasing kind of doing things backwards. Instead of solving some of the problems that should have been solved before we got the vehicles, we're now solving them afterwards, and it's slowing down what otherwise might be a very rapid deployment of electric vehicles rather substantially, because the people that might otherwise buy them have something we call range anxiety, where they go out and they're worried that they're going to run out of power but have no way to charge it. And today, even in countries where we've got a lot of electric cars, if the car runs out of power, it's still relatively unlikely that there'll be a tow truck that's been equipped with a charger that will allow the tow truck to charge the car. Where with the gas car, of course, most tow trucks carry gas cans with gas in them, and if you run out of gas, they can get you gas and get you to the gas station. So right now, with electric car, chances are you're going to have to tow it to a charging station as opposed to charge it in place, which is problematic because with electric cars, you're not supposed to tow them. You're supposed to flatbed truck them, and that adds to the expense of towing. Plus, it means you're pulling from a much smaller population of vehicles that can provide you with help. I had a problem with my electric car, and it took them about an hour and a half to get me somebody that could help me out of a flatbed truck that could hold the car off, or a regular tow truck, probably about 10 or 15 minutes. And AAA couldn't have done it. So in the end, if we're looking at the future of power, and you're an emerging country, unless you've got a substantial automotive manufacturing capability right now, you probably should be looking at things like people movers. In other words, enhancing and updating your public transportation, as opposed to spending a great deal of time on private transportation. Because in emerging economies, it's typically only the very wealthy that have vehicles. And I know in places like Singapore that they, I think they charge you upwards of $100,000 tax if you buy a vehicle. So they're really trying to restrict the sale of private vehicles. And your better path would be to enhance and increase public transportation, which tends to be more efficient overall anyway. And then you're really only dealing with roads for commercial vehicles. And there are alternatives to commercial vehicles with regard to package to shipment and delivery anyway. You can use trains, and you can use other forms of transport. Heavy lift air is one of the things that I would think an emerging economy would want to look at, because it doesn't require the road infrastructure that vehicle delivery does require. And so as we look into the future, and for countries that are being aggressive with regard to a focus on green, and you look at areas like Norway, where they've converted what were large roads and throughways for vehicles into grass-filled areas and bike lanes, and the people tend to love it. It's both healthier for the people and far greener in terms of pollution creation and energy use.
One of the important innovations in green energy is hydrogen fuel. A country like Bangladesh, India, they want to innovate more this kind of technology. Can you share some of your views?
Sorry, you broke up. Which technology you're talking about? What was the tech? Was it hydroelectric? What was the? You broke up when you asked the question.
Yeah. Hydrogen fuel, hydroelectric. Yeah.
Hydroelectric. Okay, so that's not like you said hydrofoil. Hydroelectric power. Yeah, it's assuming you've got plenty of water and the water's moving. The hydroelectric is one of the cleanest ways to generate power. But with climate change, water sources are drying up, and so if you don't have, for instance, here in the United States, one of our biggest dams outside of Las Vegas, the Hoover Dam. The Colorado River's gotten so low that it's not able to generate electricity. It's generating some, but not the way it used to. Its capacity has dropped significantly due to the loss of water, and so you just have to recognize that during climate change, if you're on the beneficial side, so you're getting a lot more rain, then certainly going to hydroelectric power would make sense. But if you're getting a lot less rain and you're already running into problems with water shortages, then putting in hydroelectric power wouldn't be advised, because you're not going to have the water to run it. The tidal power, if you have a coastline, might be another way to, because the oceans are getting deeper; they're not getting shallower. So they're not going. But it tends to work best where you've got close proximity to the oceans, because otherwise you get transport loss, which is often an issue when you're trying to move power over long distances. Wiring is not 100% efficient, and you get transport loss. And so the farther you try to move the generating source from the people that are using it, the more power you're losing through transport. And so it really would depend on, with regard to hydroelectric power, it depends on how close you are to the ocean, if you want to use the tidal form of that, or how secure your water sources are if you're going to use the more traditional dam-based approach to hydroelectric. One interesting thing about hydroelectric is you can also use it for energy storage. Pump the water up to a high altitude when you've got when solar is generating or wind's generating, and then use hydroelectric generation when solar and wind when the water then comes back down to its prior level. Use that to generate power when wind and solar are non-viable, and that's been used both by flooding mines and on mountaintops as a way to store energy. But again, I think we're going to have much better ways to store energy in 15 years, and it's probably better because those kinds of plants are going to require at least a decade to put in, and by the time you're done, there may be better, cheaper sources that can go in much more easily. So again, that's really time to anticipate where the market's going to be and what technology is going to be available in 15 years when you make the plan, as opposed to what technology is available today, because this stuff is, especially in storage, is moving fairly quickly at the moment. Now, the problem we had was we went from about 2030 to about 1930, sorry, for decade, 100 years off, 1930 to about 1980 or 1990, where we were doing a lot of research and development on batteries. And so we had 50 years of no battery research because what we thought lead acid was good enough. And it wasn't until we started doing portable electronics we discovered, not so much. And the typical batteries that were not rechargeable weren't working for us either. And so then we were able to get lithium ion to work, but it's kind of a kludge, and it largely the result of the fact that we just spent 50 years not doing the research we should have done. I think to a large extent because the petrochemical industry was concerned we were going to go with batteries prematurely. So that's one of the problems we're dealing with today. But again, if you're planning on doing something in an emerging economy and the ecosystem isn't there yet, you kind of have to look for where it's going to be in 15 years and plan for that. And the nice thing is if you develop expertise in a new energy generation technology, then you become a provider as opposed to a user of that technology, and it becomes a revenue source for you outside the country. You can sell that expertise to other countries that are then developing similar programs. Where if you're chasing technology, you're always acquiring it from overseas, and so it becomes a net deficit in terms of your country trade relationships.
Give some case study on rooftop solar projects as well as some windmill. Maybe it will be helpful for our audience. They can understand that how they can get benefit from rooftop solar and from the windmill.
Yeah, so rooftop solar, which I have here on my house, the yields from panels have gone up quite a bit. I did my first solar panel installation in the early 2000s, and then recently in the last few years I did a new solar installation on my existing house, and the yields have more than doubled off the panels, and the life of the panels have gone longer. When I did the plant back in the early 2000s, the life of a panel was only thought to be between 5 and 10 years. Now panels only lose about 3 or 4% after 20 years, and so a set of panels can remain viable for up to 40 years in use, only losing somewhere around 10% of their overall capacity. The chances are, though, you'll replace them with something that's more efficient before then. But at least now we don't have the issue with the panels really wearing out per se, as opposed to just becoming outdated. The current panels are relatively robust. They'll typically handle hail up to about a 1/4 inch. Depending, you get about a 1/2 inch of hail, you could start breaking panels. But 1/4 inch hail they'll handle. So most weather events the panels will handle, except for extreme weather events, which can often be. I mean, if a hurricane or tornado takes the roof off your house, they're going to take the panels too. But they're much more robust and much cheaper, and they last much longer than they did. But they still have the same problem. They only work during the day, and they only work when the sun and they only work most efficiently when the sun is shining on them. And typically with a roof-mounted solar, they don't do sun tracking, and that means you're only getting high yields when the sun is at a particular angle towards your house, which might only be for a couple hours a day. And you'll generate for much of the day, but you only generate at their capacity for just a couple hours when the sun is lined up. And in the winter, when the sun is lower on the horizon, your overall generation capacity is going to drop down. And of course, if you've got clouds and weather, then your generating capacity drops off rather substantially as well. So solar has that real hard limitation in terms of angle, which is problematic on a rooftop because I don't think anybody does solar tracking on rooftops. You may see some industrial installations where they're doing it on top of a factory that are that way, but on top of residential houses. I'm not aware of anybody that's done tracking on the top. Typically, solar tracking is done in solar fields and for solar farms. Wind really only works where you've got a sustained wind of about 15 knots or more. And any less than that, you're probably not moving the generator enough to generate enough power. One of the big problems initially with the large scale windmills was the fact that the blades wore out and they couldn't be recycled. Newer windmill blades can be recycled, though they do still wear out, and it's quite an endeavor. If you go on YouTube, you can see what it takes to replace a blade on one of these massive windmills, and it's not trivial. I do not envy the people that are putting offshore wind in, and what it would take to maintain those windmills, because typically they stand alone without a base, and the winds can be relatively pronounced offshore, which makes the generating very powerful, but makes maintenance problematic. And so you get turbines where you can feather the blades, so you can stop the turbines, or you run the risk of using brakes and either overheating the brakes or having the brakes fail, which could be life-threatening for anybody that's working on the turbines. Also, there was an issue with large and small scale turbines where they were kind of Cuisinarts for birds. If you go to any of the large windmill plants, say in California, you'll see a lot of dead birds underneath the windmills, which has been problematic. Newer windmill designs to get away from that fan design and go to something that's a bit less deadly to birds have proven to be far more animal friendly, or fowl friendly, if you will. And so some of the newer designs are not only do a better job with regard to adjusting for where the wind's coming from without having to pivot the entire windmill, which is very stressful on the structure. And every once in a while, you'll see a windmill fail catastrophically and fall over. The newer windmills appear to be much more stable in their base, don't kill as many birds, and have fewer moving parts, so they're easier to maintain. And because they often use a different mechanism to generate the power, it doesn't look like the blades wear out, at least not as rapidly as the more traditional design. So we are moving to better designs. One interesting thing is windmills on top of buildings. As wind hits a building, it tends to come up the side of the building and accelerate. And so the windmills on building roofs tend to be smaller and angled down at about a 45-degree angle to pick up that wind that's coming up off the buildings. I haven't seen many implementations, and I have a feeling it's because it's somewhat unsightly. They have a bunch of what looks like large fans sitting up on top of a building. And again, probably problematic for any birds that are riding that thermal layer up the side of a building. Probably a whole lot of dead pigeons, because pigeons like to land on building sizes, and having a bunch of fans on top of the side of the building is probably going to do something terrible to the pigeon population. Though a lot of people that live in cities aren't huge fans of pigeons to begin with, so I'm not sure that's as negative as it might otherwise be. I think a lot of us that lived in cities refer to pigeons as flying rats. Shame, but no reason why we're disparaging rats. So that's kind of it with regard to rooftop solar and rooftop wind.
We want to learn more about research and innovation procedure for green energy, as you are working for many largest companies in Silicon Valley. So we'd love to learn more about your experience.
Well, most of the large companies have fairly large solar plants. Apple's spaceship headquarters has a very large solar plant on its perimeter that generates much of the power for the place, and significant battery backup capabilities, so that they have power at night. I don't recall whether they've pulled full off grid, but they generate most of their power right at the plant site, and that's what you see most often. Is you see a plant site that either is covered with solar panels on the roof, or that they're buying their power from a solar or wind generating facility that's in close proximity to the site. And that's the most common way. I'm not aware of any plant sites that have put in nuclear energy. There've been a lot of discussions in the 60s, 70s, and 80s about doing that, but I'm not aware of any implementations. Remember back then we even had a cruise ship that had nuclear power. I think it was the Queen Elizabeth II that had the nuclear engine in it, but it was retired long ago, and I'm not aware of any non-military vessels today that have nuclear power. It just proved to be unworkable, even though in effect you had almost free fuel for the life of life of the ship, but getting, nuclear engineers to work on a cruise ship apparently proved to be problematic. Anyway, it was just the one ship that was done. So no nuclear, and there was some exploration in terms of doing geothermal. Geothermal is sometimes done on remote sites for whatever reason, but more often military than commercial. In that regard, remote research and development. I believe there've been implementations of geothermal there, but I'm not aware of a lot of geothermal plant sites. There was HP did a big methane generating plant. They located a plant near a large milk farm, and then they would collect the manure and use it to generate methane, and then they would pipe the methane into a methane generator, and generate the power off it as a way to make use of the methane and consume some of the methane. But that was they only did it in one plant, and I don't believe they ever spread it anyplace else. But it was one of the things that was explored. I think they did that in the 1990s, if I remember correctly. But I don't even know if they still do it on that plant anymore. I haven't had an update since then. But mostly it's solar, some form of solar, either on the plant site or purchased remotely from a solar or wind provider.
So thank you. This is excellent discussion, especially for our youth community. If you give your last advice, how we can train more people for green energy, and what's your concluding remarks for today's session?
Well, where much of the advancement is going on today, we've done a lot of advancement in solar and wind and geothermal and nuclear fusion. Where the advance is going on today, and probably the best for an emerging economy, are microgrids. Becoming familiar with microgrids and the technologies that can be applied to it, as well as solid state storage, which is where the industry is massively pivoting or going eventually. And then with regard to distribution, you have, when you're talking about microgrids, you have less of a problem of having to put up an awful lot of infrastructure, either above or below ground, and you're pretty much providing the power people need close to where they need it. And then as you're building out the ecosystem, beginning with the idea of choosing sources that are both forward-looking and green by nature, as opposed to more traditional sources, so you aren't installing stuff that is already obsolete. So your knowledge base is more on the cutting edge, with the underlying goal of becoming eventually a technology supplier, as opposed to just a technology consumer, because countries just don't do well if you have to sell something to have trade, and if you're constantly consuming the most expensive stuff that other countries support, it's very hard to stop becoming an emerging economy and becoming a developed nation. And the real difference between a developed nation and an emerging nation is a developed nation stands on its own and has enough resources to support other countries. Emerging countries typically are struggling to support themselves, and so making that pivot into becoming a supplier as opposed to a user should be a fundamental goal of every government.
Thank you, Professor Rao, for your excellent contribution. Today's session is very, very important because World Talent Economy Forum trying to solve the problem of solar energy-related problem in emerging economy. So your guideline, your advice, and your strategy will be helpful for us. Thank you for joining today's session. Thank you. Bye-bye and take care.